Welcome to the latest episode of Unfiltered Conversations. I'm your host, Ryan McNeil. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jared, let me get this right, the head distiller for Balcones Distillery in Waco, Texas. Jared, thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Balcones started in an old welding shop under a bridge in Waco, I believe.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about the origins of Balcones?
Man, it's kind of one of those you just keep putting one foot in front of the other story. We didn't really we tried to open a brewery a couple times. It was me and some friends from our homebrew club and a friend of a friend who had a little bit of money, and we fell in love with single malts, and then it just made sense as brewers. You try your hand at things that you enjoy, and it kind of increases your relationship to them, your appreciation of them. So we kind of started fiddling around to see what making your own single malt took, and if we had enough, beer experience to pull that off. And then it kind of spilled over to the garage, and real estate in Waco at the time was super cheap. And so we figured we'd probably get a building, and then we figured we'd probably get a permit just so we were legal. And it just kind of kept going and going. And it is kind of weird to wake up, this year is our 15th anniversary, and it is a weird thing to look back and tell that story sometimes, because it really was a little bit of one day you look up and realize how far you've walked, but in the meantime, all you just kept doing was the next thing that made sense, and here we are. Um, so yeah, I think beer is a big part of the history. Kind of DIY, get your hands dirty culture is a big part of the history, and then really just a pretty raw, visceral, just love for single malts that turned into a love for a lot of different things eventually. But yeah.
So you're one of the first craft distilleries in all of Texas. So how did you know this market wanted a whiskey distillery, or was it just like you're saying, one foot in front of the other? Is what you wanted to do? Is about you were enjoying? What was the thought process there?
We knew Texas didn't have any active whiskey going on, but that was definitely a secondary. That was not the original. Like, I know a lot of business ideas come about with people looking at kind of market information where there's kind of a gap and someone deciding we should fill that gap. Those conversations, we were already doing it before we were really thinking about that. We were actually surprised once we started getting going and doing research to find out that there weren't any. Was actually kind of surprised us. We thought for sure. I mean, Texas and cattle drives and old westerns, you're just thinking surely there's whiskey here. Just to find out there really wasn't. So that was kind of an after the fact thing that was kind of fun and nice to find out. And really, I've yet to find historical evidence of any, even pre-prohibition. I'm sure there was people moonshining and stuff, but most of the whiskey even that was being drunk in Texas back in those days was coming from Kentucky and Tennessee and other places. So yeah, it seems like a big weird historical anomaly. Like, surely Texas had a ton of whiskey back in the day, but it really didn't, or it wasn't making any here. So but it's kind of fun for really a lot of the craft distilleries all over the country. A lot of people are operating in places that don't have a big whiskey tradition. Our whiskey traditions in the US, rum and rye, kind of colonial 13 colony era, and then we've got modern era, we've got Kentucky and Tennessee. And so pretty much not that different from somebody in, say, Idaho. Like, I'm sure somebody in Idaho is maybe the first whiskey ever made there, and then maybe you're only 10 years old or 12 years old or something. So but to have Texas turning into a thing and getting a lot of attention nationally and internationally for the whiskey coming out of Texas, now in hindsight, 15 years later, it does feel super cool to, like, at the time, being on the ground level of a new relevant whiskey region. We were not very aware of it at the moment, and now it's like this thing that, like, man, I wish we had been more aware of it then, how important that was and what was actually happening. But there's no way to know where things are going to go. But yeah, it's pretty cool. It's not a lot of times in your life that getting to be a part of something that literally doesn't exist and getting to help get that off the ground and rolling. Like, how many times is that going to happen in someone's lifetime? That's a rare gift. It's pretty cool.
Your original distillery lasted until 2015.
Yeah.
And it was hand built, the original one. Was it tough emotionally to move to a bigger or a new distillery because of all that emotional attachment to the first
Yeah,
one?
yeah. So while we were finishing out the new building, and there was a lot of there are engineers everywhere, and people are commissioning equipment and testing things out. There was so much of that going on. There were days where I still went back to the old building and I was finishing. We had low lines already, the first distillation already done. We had stuff in tank. And so some of the last distillations that were done down there wasn't the normal hustle and bustle of 11 people in the building. It was like a 3,000 square foot building, pretty small. Um, but when that was our base of operations, it was kind of a hornet's nest. I mean, there's people everywhere. There's hoses on the ground. There's barrels under your desk. Um, but those last few ones ended up in my memory. They're pretty special moments because I literally was just down there all day, only person in the building, knowing these are kind of the last runs with these stills and in this space. And yeah, it, those few days, those like I think it was like 3 or 4 days, just those last couple weeks before we started here, that I didn't think I was going to miss it until those days, and then I kind of hit me that like this is the end of a whole chapter, and it it was a lot more work to operate. It was a lot more time and labor intensive to do it that way and at that scale. But in some ways, it was a lot more intimate because of that. Like if I was doing a spirit run, I'd pretty much camp out. I'd take my laptop up on the platform right there by the condensers and the spirit safe where the liquid's coming out, and tasting things, smelling things, adjusting flame because those were direct fire. Um, there was a lot more inconsistency and variability. They were tricky to run. They were kind of finicky, but they were ours, and we knew them well. And you could kind of just be by yourself all day. And I put music on, and maybe I'd do some spreadsheets or pay the feds taxes or whatever else I had to do. But you kind of had to camp out, or you could miss something. And it's impractical. I'm glad I don't spend my time that way, but I'm glad at some point that I did. I'm glad that there's 8 years of that out of 15 that were that kind of very intensive level of interaction, both with the equipment and the liquid coming off. Just by necessity, that's how it was. And that's a pretty sweet time. I actually think about people that have joined us since. Um, a lot of stuff about that place wasn't super safe. It wasn't made the best way, maybe, but we did. It was ours. And every once in a while, I do remember. I have to remind myself, someone that's only worked for us since we've been here, that there's kind of this duct tape and bootstrap version of what this used to be that isn't really in there. It's not part of their personal history. And yeah, every once in a while it just hits me how special that time was, for sure.
And you mentioned you hadn't really realized how that would hit you to the end. So I'm wondering, when that is hitting you at the end, did you keep some mementos just to stick in your office to remind you? Was it one of the barrels? Is it a couple of bottles? There's something that you kept from that last run that you maybe have in your office or somewhere in the new facility that's a good reminder for you?
Yeah. I have a little jar of the last couple of ounces of stuff that we made at home, and I have uh, new make from the last run down there and new make from the first run here, both. Yeah, and I don't think I ever even plan to necessarily open them up, or if I do, it'll be because I know the end is nigh, kind of maybe a retirement or something. Pull things out just for fun. Um, but we still have a few barrels left of stuff we made down there, and every year when we're talking about our special releases and what kind of weird stuff we're going to release this year to the public, we look at those, but there's so little left. I think we might just bottle some of it up and have a little stash somewhere that's just kind of for family. It seems at this point like that's probably more important to us than maybe anybody on the planet. So we'll see. But it is fun to go visit those barrels every once in a while.
As we shift from the history into maybe a little more the science of what you do, I think a good lead in is, what are some of the perks of the new facility? You mentioned that you can do more, maybe it's more time effective, maybe it's less not
Yeah.
hands-on, but it's less intense maybe? What are
Yeah.
some of the perks of the new facility?
Yeah, our old building, we crammed so much in there, and we literally had guys on staff that were like 5'4", and I'm like 6'3". So there were places that weren't a good fit for anybody just because of where we placed something. And we had like a couple platforms leading up to the mash tun and the condensers and things. And there were things that were too high for people to reach. And then, of course, if I was cleaning out the mash tun, I was hitting my head on the roof. And or we made this massive stainless steel paddle. We had a like an old wooden, like more like traditional European like wooden mash paddle, and we broke it. We're like, we need to make one out of metal, so we welded a big stainless one. 500-gallon fermenters. You do a corn cook and you pump it over, and while you're getting it to cool off and you're putting enzymes and you're putting yeast in, like somebody's got to stir that. There's no motor with an impeller on it. And those are the kind of things that I think seem super quaint to a whiskey drinker and fan when they walk in and see, wow, like that thing is being stirred by a person. But I guarantee you, nobody that ever used to have to do that, and this is doing it. Although we didn't have to go to the gym, we just work was enough. And so there's a few things like that that I don't miss. I think on the creative side, the nicest thing about having a higher volume, and even using steam as opposed to direct fire is really predictability and consistency. So down there, if we had a weird idea that we wanted to try, one fermentation is only going to give us, let's see, one fermentation would give us 1 barrel eventually. So you distill it once, distill a second time, we end up with one 53-gallon barrel basically. Which means to do anything in triplicate, to get like actual research off of any idea, is literally impossible. Every barrel is different. There's no way to consolidate 3 fermentations and then run 3 barrels that are homogeneous. They're all their own thing. And so if we were doing a proofing experiment or trying out a different toast or anything like that, you weren't always sure if there was apples to apples, right? Down here, immediately, it was like, man, we can save up a couple of days runs. Now we've got like 40 or 50 barrels that are all exactly the same liquid. We can do proofing experiments. We can put things in different parts of the warehouse and track them. And actually have usable information on if we want to tweak something like a little fruitier or change the mouthfeel or whatever it is that we're trying to like tweak a product. We could do things that actually yielded results that we could trust. So that was one of the first big benefits that I realized is tracking kind of the innovation and R&D side of what we do, which is a big part of what we do. Was not just anecdotal. It was actual real, like, this is real information. It's replicable. We did it in at least triplicate, if not more. I don't know. So some of those things, that was a little bit of a surprise. I think there's going bigger, even as a maker, sometimes I think you assume this is going to kind of get kind of homogenized and more boring and more just like consistent. But we found that it actually allowed us to be more intentional about the diversity, and our play became a little bit more purposeful and less harebrained. Back at the old building, if we did something weird and we liked it, then we did it again a year or two later and it wasn't the same, and we didn't know, like, it just wasn't controllable enough to know what that meant or why it happened. But down here, that's a lot easier to track, which is fun.
When I went for one of the tours, something that I was intrigued by, and I don't fully understand, so I'm going to ask again.
Yeah.
Because you're the expert. Why is your rye not malted and instead used raw?
We did some malted rye. Malted rye has a really unique, it just has a very specific and unique profile. It's not that we even didn't like it, but we're still not sure what we think about it. We've done it a couple times and we have those barrels lying around, and the fruit on them is really interesting. There's a ton of craft distillers doing 100% malted even, and it's not that it's a bad idea, but if you can ever get your hand on one, for a fact this is malted rye, not raw. The profile is so different from a traditional kind of American rye whiskey flavor profile. And so for those reasons, it's exciting to try. But I think we're nowhere near traditional. Obviously, like our ryes and bourbons are never going to pass for Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana ryes and bourbons. But I think those traditions are kind of important to us, and there are aspects of those profiles that we do feel like are important to maintain and carry through even our weird spin on them. And that was one specific area that the more we played around, the more we just did sensory, even when we didn't know what was in front of us, just blind checking barrels or checking new make. Really just the blending team and the distilling team, like we just always responded to the raw versions on a personal level. And so we've mostly stayed down that path.
This is a tricky question. I've been trying to figure out how to ask it because if you ask a parent about their favorite kid, they're gonna be like, "No, it's not my
Oh
favorite
yeah.
kid."
Yeah.
But you guys have won a lot of awards. You have a lot of recognition. So I don't want to ask what your favorite is, but I'd love to hear maybe some that were pivotal, either encouraging you early on, maybe it's been encouraging moving into the new building. So again, not your favorite awards, but a little twist on that. Like, what are some awards? What's some recognition that you guys have received that has made a big difference in you guys moving forward?
Well, I'm first and foremost a malt guy. Personally, I'm curious, and so we've done a lot of different things, even rum, another. Um, we try not to make anything that we're not interested in. So, like, every once in a while, someone will say something like, "Why don't you guys make gin?" And I'm like, nobody on the blending creative team is like that into it. I wouldn't even know if it was good. So, like, why? That doesn't make sense to me. Knowing that my context for how to rate it and how to critique it would be pretty introductory. So that said, my malts are all, our malts are always going to be my favorites. And as you know, I don't know how old you are now, but things change over time. Like, the rowdy, craziest, highest ABV with all the adjunct beers that I liked in my 20s, and I probably drink way more Pilsner than just about anything else. Not that I don't appreciate those, but in some ways, life keeps going and you kind of circle back sometimes to like early things. And I find myself wanting 43, 46% lower ABV, lighter barrel character, fruity, pleasant, kind of subtle, nuanced single malts these days instead of like the rowdiest, craziest thing. But there was some early recognition for our Texas One single malt back in 2012. The award that we won in the UK didn't really make that big of a difference until Clay Risen picked it up and wrote a story about it for the New York Times like 6 months later. But obviously, that's got a decent sized readership. So people were literally walking that lived like 3 blocks from the distillery that didn't know we were there until the New York Times article comes out. And they're like, "You guys have been making whiskey like 3 blocks from my house for years. I didn't even know it was here." So that was definitely a big one that we immediately went from, us bugging stores and trying to do as much tastings and running around and trying to get bottles in front of people like, "Please order some stuff. We're tiny. We're just trying to get going," to by the end of that year, I was able to fill that year about 11 or 12% of the orders that came in. So it really wasn't overnight. We're scrounging, we're hustling we could be 10 times bigger and we still would barely be able to keep up, like almost overnight. Which also sounds kind of cool, but it was a nightmare. When 88% of the people that want to buy your stuff can't get any, then basically most of your time is spent fielding calls with upset people, which is not particularly fun. So that was kind of the moment we knew that sometime in the next few years we've either got to expand here or move to a new place. Like we just can't. If the goal, some people obviously start with the business plan, which I already told you that wasn't really like that wasn't the drive to do it. But the idea that we make something that matters to people and that connects with folks and they can't get it, that's one of the best reasons to expand that I can imagine. And it kind of weighed on us to like, And it took years. Obviously, we didn't get in here until 2016. So those next 4 years were all about that. How can we increase? How, you know, we need investment. We got to figure out, can we do that here? We bought the building we're in now. At first, it was just warehousing. Eventually, we knew we had to like get bigger stills, and that this was the place that we're going to have to go. And all that's still going on. I mean, we just added more silos for grain a couple weeks ago. We got more fermenters coming. It's kind of a never ending swelling. But I'm sure someday we'll level out. But for now, it's still a matter of trying to, you know, when you make something like with your own blood and sweat and tears that matters to folks, you know, it does feel really good to spend a lot of time and effort to figure out how to get it in their hands, you know. It's not abstract. It's a very concrete, like that's a pretty, at the end of the day, you know what you're working towards. And there's no vagary around it, you know. You make something, people like it, they care about it, they can't get it, there's not enough to go around, you need to make more. So and now I don't remember what the question was. Pivotal moments. Yeah. Last so that was the first one. And then I think, what year was it? I think it was 2020 maybe, that we made our kind of entry single malt lineage, which has only been out for a few years, was the first American single malt to make Whiskey Advocate's top 20 list. At, I think it was number 17, which it was a pretty new product at the time. I think it had only been out less than a year, and that was a pretty cool, because you've got your tried and true things, you know, that have been around for a while and have their own following and reputation. And every time you kind of drop something new or kind of add to the family, there can be a little bit of, you know, you hope it lands, and you hope it's on par with the rest of the portfolio. And to have that be new, it was intentionally a lower ABV and a little bit more affordable. We wanted it to be a gateway for people that if price or the flavor profile or the strength are barriers to people dipping their toes in this thing they've been hearing about, that's American single malt, we were trying to just remove as many barriers. So the profile is a little bit more familiar, the ABV is lower, we made it affordable. And to have that end up on that list, it is one of those things where kind of like, man, we had an idea and we thought it would do a few things, and then to get that kind of feedback loop going, where like it does check those boxes for people. And to be the first one ever on that list, like that, firsts are first, you know, that's going to be, yeah, that's always going to be the case. That was the first one that ever made that list. So that's pretty cool too.
So you guys have classics, annual releases, and special releases. Why is it important to stay true to a handful of whiskeys, your classics, but also keep trying new flavors? Is that just to create a process? Is that just you loving to experiment? What's the thought process behind these special releases and just trying new things?
Yeah. I know not there are obviously other distillers that are not motivated in the same way, and I don't know what that's about, because internally we're pretty much all kind of built that way. Some of it I think is a byproduct of being kind of self-taught, and like we literally have one person in 15 years that's worked in a distillery before, and she's only been here for like a year. We've kind of avoided that on purpose. We've found some cool ways of doing things that if we had known what you're supposed to do, maybe we wouldn't have tried, but they've worked out really good for us. Some educated guesses, or even things about beer making that are very different from distilling, that the more we learned, we were kind of like, well, why does nobody do it the way beer would do it? And there's some of them that's like, oh, that's the reason, that's a bad idea. And some of them were like, that's actually not a bad idea, it's just not how things are done. Some of those things we still do. So I think being self-taught, a lot of our brain processes are still around the parts of the business and the process and the art that we don't understand. And so it's always kind of like, ooh, I wonder what would happen if, which then usually leads to research, going through literature, maybe doing a test batch. And sometimes you're like, oh, I thought that would be cooler. And sometimes something that you didn't think was going to be that interesting or make that big of a difference, like even adjusting your pitch rate or under aerating some a fermentation or something, that technically I understand what those things can and can't do, but then to have the results be really badass, it's like, whoa, man, I would never have done that if it wasn't beer background. Or, we've got my 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 spirits director, warehouse manager slash, blending partner is super into wine. He's always coming up with stuff from that world that just kind of gets the juices flowing. Um, and there's other craft distilleries that have taken practices from cognac or other traditions, um, and it kind of incorporated them into whiskey making processes. And I think that's all really fun. There's things that we kind of had siloed maybe in beverage alcohol or even food or even just in aesthetic things in the world, that we've kind of kept. Yeah, there's this tradition and they do things and this and this and this. And people starting to realize, well, why don't we cross pollinate some of these things? And oh, there's this technique that wine does. There's this technique that rum does. Like, let's mess around with that with single malt, or whatever, and just see what happens. So, um, at the same time, I don't know that if that's all you did, that would really work for people. I mean, even just as humans, we have a really innate desire for familiarity. Familiarity is where kind of our sense of safety, trust, whether it's living in the same place, if it's family, if it's a community or a part of whatever it is, or even the idea of comfort food. We go back to shit we ate when we were kids, right? Um, and if that's present, then there's this other human need that is newness, it's adventure, it's exploration, right? And the dance between those two, I think a lot of whiskey brands do really good at being the same for my dad, for me, for my granddad, that kind of. A lot of whiskey historically has done really well at providing comfort and familiarity, predictability, and not maybe so good on the other side. But once again, we came from like craft beer backgrounds, and that's the whole thing. I mean, like, man, there's a new thing coming out all the time, and every breweries do things all the time that never even happen again. And I think so in our mind, it just made sense to do it that way. And if you combine that with all the curiosity and unanswered questions that we walked into this with and still have to this day, it just kind of made sense. And luckily for us, the market has gone that way a little bit, where everyone's trying to innovate and do wacky stuff. And even really big 200-year-old brands that we're all super familiar with that, had one expression up until 10 years ago. Now they've got 6 new things, So it seems like everybody understands that there's some dance there between an old standard and variation. And I think also whiskey makers want to communicate that to their drinkers now, that the same way you feel, and you're trying new things that come out and you're chasing down bottles and like, oh, distiller you've never heard of, and going on a tour, that we have that same relationship to whiskey. We're just as curious too. I still have salespeople that, like, if something drops and I know I'm not going to get it in Waco, I have someone run out and make sure and grab a couple bottles for us to try before it's gone. Those kinds of things. So we're really fortunate in that I feel like the people within Balcones that are responsible for the whiskey itself and the kind of the aesthetics and creative decisions, when we interact with our drinkers, like, we're like the same. We just happen to be on the production side of it and you're on the consumption side of it. But what we love about it, why we're motivated, like, it wasn't that long ago, it was 15 years ago where I was that and not a distiller. So I remember that very distinctly, and it definitely affects how we decide what to make. A lot of times it's just asking ourselves, like, what we would be interested in. If fill in the blank distillery was to drop a weird project that was made this way, would I buy it? And you're like, yeah, I would buy it. That's almost good enough. We're like, well, let's do it. If I would be interested in someone else doing it and it hasn't been done, let's do it ourselves and see where it goes.
Jared, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate hearing about the history and your creative process and some of the science base of this. So again, thank you for your time. I really appreciated it.
Absolutely, man. Good talking to you. Thanks for having me on.